This is Duke University.
Two decades ago, when scholars like Michael Eric Dyson and John Michael Spencer were writing about hip hop and religion, their research was very much viewed as that of outliers. Yet today we can look at scholars like Emmett Price, Monica Miller, and Ebony Utley, who've each published new books dealing with the intersections of hip hop, race, and religion. Today, Professor Miller, Professor Utley, and Professor Price join us via Skype on Left to Black. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, and I'm your host.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon, a special hip hop and religion summit, if you want to call it that. Featuring Professor Emmett Price, who is Associate Professor of Music and African American Studies at Northeastern University. He's also the editor of the new book, The Black Church and Hip Hop Culture, Toward Bridging the Generational Divide, at Scarecrow Press. We're also joined by Professor Ebony Utley, who comes to us from the California State University at Long Beach, where she's an Assistant Professor of Communication and the author of the new book, Rap and Religion, Understanding the Gangster's God. That's a Prager Press release. And lastly, we're joined by Professor Monica R. Miller, visiting Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Lewis and Clark College in Oregon, Portland. And she's the author of the new book, Religion and Hip Hop, which was just published in August by Routledge. How's everybody doing this afternoon?
Good.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you.
So let me start with this idea that, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, if someone wanted to teach a class on hip hop and religion, they would have had to copy a bunch of articles. There were no PDFs to be used a decade ago. You'd be copying a few articles from John Michael Spencer from Black Sacred Music. You might have found a couple of pieces by Anthony Penn. The idea that 10 years later, that literally 3 books on hip hop and religion would be published within months of each other speaks a great deal, I think, about obviously where hip hop studies is, but also this interesting intersection between hip hop and religious studies. And so I'll start by just asking the three of you to talk a little bit about your books, what you were hoping to achieve. We'll start with you, Professor Utley, talking about The Gangster's God.
The Gangster's God is about how and why rappers rap about God. And for me, putting together the book was a personal journey. I've been having these conversations in my head about should there be as strong a distinction between rap music and religion as my mother always wanted me to have. So I've been working that out personally and professionally for about the last 10 years. And what I really want people to get from rap and religion, understanding the Gangster's God, is that God is different things to different people at different times for different reasons. And who God is to someone when they're 20 is not who God is going to be when they're 30 or 40 years old. So the message I want to get across is that God is. And it isn't necessary to fill in the blank. Instead, it's important to think of God as a social construction and see how and why God is used.
There are ways in which your book, Professor Miller, is also deeply in conversation with, religious philosophy, postmodern thought. Talk a little bit about what you were trying to achieve with your book.
So what I essentially wanted to do with religion and hip hop was to sort of give that subfield, that area of study, a textbook in a way. So not assuming students have any kind of knowledge with religion and hip hop, or even are squarely rooted in the discipline of religious studies, that they'd be able to now have a book where they could go to understand and make sense of theory, method, and data. And one of the things that I argue in religion and hip hop is that while we have a lot of proliferation around scholarship as it pertains to religion and rap music, I mean, as you mentioned, we have John Michael Spencer's work and Michael Eric Dyson's work and Anthony Penn's work, but what we lack is, in fact, that very interrogation of the category of religion. And so what I try to do in religion and hip hop is to sort of give religion and hip hop scholarship a postmodern facelift, if you will.
Professor Price, Emmett, you, of course, have been a choir director before. And in some ways, with your new book, you're functioning very much in that role as a choir director, directing all these incredible voices who've weighed in on this thought of hip hop and religion. Talk a little bit about how this project comes together and how you get all these folks to contribute to this particular project.
That's a great question. You know, as a musician and as a pastor and as a professor, as a scholar, I find that we have these conversations in our various enclaves. And so one of the challenges of the book was to bring these voices together and allow the church to know that there's a conversation that they need to be a part of, to allow, you know, hip hop practitioners and part of the hip hop, you know, world, if not hip hop generation, that there's a conversation that they should participate in, that the scholars, you know, and all of us, and that this is a dynamic conversation that we should all participate in, regardless of what our viewpoints and our differences are. The fact is, these are our lives, and it's a timely discussion. And so I brought together a number of theologians, pastors, preachers, practitioners, scholars, bloggers, to have this really dynamic conversation. The reality was that all of us, although we didn't all agree, had more similarities than we did differences.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon at Hip Hop and Religion Summit with Professor Emmett Price of Northeastern University, who's the editor of the new book, The Black Church and Hip Hop Culture Toward Bridging the Generational Divide. We're also joined by Professor Ebony Utley, Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at California State Long Beach, who's the author of the new book, Rap and Religion, Understanding the Gangster's God. And we're also joined by Professor Monica R. Miller, who's a visiting assistant professor of religious studies at Lewis and Clark College, and the author of the new book, Religion and Hip Hop. As I was thinking about all three of these books, and that's part of what's really amazing about this. I mean, you all are tackling this subject in very distinct and different ways. And as I tried to come up with some, you know, short language to kind of put them in some sort of context, you know, the three separate discussions, one which is along the line of unpacking the black church and its relationship to hip hop. Another might be hip hop's own relationship to religion, but then hip hop's own religion. You know, it's kind of three very separate and distinct conversations. I mean, how would you respond to kind of parsing out conversations about hip hop and religion in that particular way? And jump in.
Well, I'll go ahead. For me, like I said, what I wanted to do was really interrogate what scholars purport to mean when they claim they're doing an investigation or an exploration of the category of religion. And so it is a question that has remained unexamined in the scholarship. And what I argue is that there's been this kind of predominant question that has guided religion and hip hop scholarship, which is what is religious about hip hop culture. And in that very question, it sort of presupposes that we're all on the same page when it comes to religion. And in this little area of religion and hip hop scholarship that's emerging and growing, one of the things that I found was that it's sort of dominated by confessional, apologetic, personal, theological, and hermeneutical approaches. And I'm very clear in religion and hip hop that I don't think that that's how we as scholars ought to treat the data.
Right.
I mean, for me, it's oversimplified, but I think it's the essence of the relationship. Both hip hop and religion are expressions and responses to oppression. And I think that both sides have always been part and parcel of both forms. So there was never a moment when hip hop was not religious in that sense. Hip hop has always been a form of expression, and it's always been a response to oppression, the same way that the Black church and other religious themes have worked in the Black community over time.
You know, this is an important point that Dr. Utley makes, and that, you know, part of the fulcrum and the launching point for the book that, you know, I put together was the fact that we get so caught up in the tradition of the Black church and the kind of responsiveness or reactionary aspect of the Black church, that the whole notion of progression and forward thinking and vision is lacking in my, you know, personal opinion. And so when I'm working with young people and they don't feel that they have a place in the church, and I use my book as a case study. So, you know, I went after the Black church first, you know, because that's my roots. But I got to go after the white church, the Asian church, the purple church, the blue church, the future church, you know, because the point is, at the end of the day, if we're true to God's command upon us, then we're supposed to realize that we're all supposed to come together in unity and solidarity at some point. And so being caught in our own enclaves and being comfortable and stagnant and staying there means that young generations who are already progressive in their social atmosphere, in their political atmosphere, in their theological atmosphere, are out on their own, without the wisdom, without the expertise, and without the brilliance of the elders. So my book challenges the church and challenges the hip hop culture to bridge the gap, come together and have these conversations, and take the cream and leave the crop.
Dr. Price, I agree. Like, vision and progress are essential, absolutely essential. But I think we also have to recognize that flip side, right? That religion has its downside. It has its oppressive tendencies, just like hip hop continues to do as well.
Go ahead, Emmett.
The beauty of your statement, and you're absolutely right, is when you look at hip hop culture doesn't stay within the religious idiom, it goes to the spiritual idiom. And when we deal with the spiritual idiom, then we have a real conversation, because most religions in this world that we live in, and perhaps other worlds out there within the galaxy, use the word God. But as you said before, the way we define God is based on cultural history, legacy, and all these different things. And so when we're able to have a conversation about God as opposed to the religious cage that we put God within, then we're on to something.
Professor Neal, can I just jump in on that point?
Yeah.
And actually, I probably would disagree with both Professor Utley and Professor Price in that in my text, Religion and Hip Hop, I actually argue that we've been too titillated by and obsessed with the separation between Black church and then alternative sort of Black spiritualities. Or, I mean, I actually think for too long we've been, in fact, the original title to my book was Beyond the Black Church, The Quest for Meaning in Hip Hop Culture. And I realized that I was actually unconsciously setting up this juxtaposition between Black church and hip hop, and kind of walking hip hop or the religious uses and references within hip hop within a kind of linear teleology of crisis, oppression, this thing that kind of wrestles between fixity, stasis, mobility, and I don't necessarily think it's that neat or neatly packaged.
It's interesting that as the conversation goes this way, and Emmett, I know you're also a popular music scholar. So we go back 60 years and we think about the great innovations of Ray Charles, right? And in some ways, the very point that Professor Miller just made, an artist like Ray Charles got that. Right, his music was a music that spoke to both the Saturday night and the Sunday morning, right? Didn't feel the need to kind of parse out in different spaces. Over the course of the summer, there was, of course, a controversy that broke out over the Philly-based rapper Meek Mill and his song Amen. And, it's been some time since I've been in the club. But if I was in the club and Amen came on, I'd be on the dance floor. And I wonder how you think about, on the one hand, taking this notion of spirituality and the Black church and putting it in a distinct secular context in the way that hip hop does on a regular basis. How do you respond to folks who want to have a protest or a boycott what they see is something that is blasphemous, but at the same time it really does speak to where the hip hop generation might be in terms of thinking about the church as structure and the spirituality that they hope to get from that experience when they've totally rejected the structure of the church in some ways?
Well, let's go back in history, and I'm glad you make that point, because historically, in the quote-unquote Black communities, and I never, just make it one community, but in the Black communities, the church was usually the central place that all people operated from, believers and non-believers. Right. So the reality is, within our cultural construct, the church has always had a confusing placement within our communities, right? So the notion that gospel music is only gospel, a la, Thomas Andrew Dorsey, who was one of the greatest blues musicians of all time, right? The whole notion that gospel music is only gospel message to sacred, musicianship. As a musician, a middle C is a middle C. Whether you're playing, Chopin, whether you're playing John Coltrane, whether you're playing Mahalia Jackson, a middle C is a middle C. So there is no gospel middle C and a sacred middle C. The instrument is an instrument by which you use your intentionality and your passion to speak, right? So the fact is that many of us who segment and segregate the sacred and secular have already missed something. And so the notion of spirituality, when you go back into our cosmology, back into the motherland, if you will, or the fatherland, because we go both ways. But if you go back to the continent of Africa, you realize that some of the terminology that we use did not separate dance from oration, in singing, and the notion is that all of it was very practical and pragmatic. So somewhere in our African Americanness, or our Afro Americanness, or our Blackness, or our, whatever time phase it happened, we kind of lost the sense of the holistic purview of our liveliness.
I think I would agree with Professor Price. I think it has to do with how scholars deal with the sacred and the profane. And I think that most people involved in the scholarship on religion and hip hop, whether, it be other hip hop modalities or rap music in particular, we're upfront that we don't see a separation between the sacred and the profane, but that's not the way that we write about it, because I think we're so unconscious of it, and we've been sort of taught to think about it in that way. And it particularly comes up in moments that really speak to the kind of moralism in the public and the civic face of hip hop culture. When pastors calling on Meek Mill to apologize for a song, Amen, I mean, for me to even ask a question, is the song blasphemous, is to in fact participate in the, it's legitimating the authenticity. I'd say it's a ridiculous question.
Nice.
Blasphemous. He's a rapper. He's not a minister. He's not speaking for one particular community. He's an entertainer. He's playing with rhetoric. He's playing with language. Same thing we do in the pulpit. I almost think giving legitimation to the kind of question is almost insidious in a way.
One of the things that I like, and you just used some of that language a second ago, Professor Miller, this idea of the civic face of hip hop. And so immediately when you see books like yours roll out into the world, and obviously there's been an explosion of classes around this notion of hip hop and religion, and just like conversations around hip hop studies, right? The larger public, right, does not see the civic face of hip hop as being something that has any relationship to religion, religiosity, spirituality, in a church. How do you respond to the naysayers, right? And unfortunately, the naysayers aren't just, white Christians on the right from some southern city. Some of those folks are coming from northern cities that have large populations, that the church itself is a block away from the club, who have very hard criticisms of thinking about hip hop, and as an extension, right? Because it's really not just a critique of hip hop, it's a critique of black youth as being amoral and a-religious, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right. And it's interesting. Really, in religion and hip hop, I try to bring together the category of religion, the modality of hip hop culture, and also the demographic of youth. Because when we invariably talk about hip hop, whether we try to politicize it or religion it in a certain kind of way, there's always a particular human means, interest, and ends at stake. And so we either want to Christianize it, we either want to separate the sacred and the profane, in the social scientific data on black youth in particular, I think Kathy Cohen's work has shown this. 87% or more of black youth compared to their white and Hispanic counterparts, claim some kind of religious affiliation, and yet we see this large decline of church participation. Right. It is, in fact, that very moral panic and that kind of anxiety that even makes us ask the question, could hip-hop be a place? Hip-hop doesn't replace the religiosity of the church, because I wouldn't even put them together in that kind of way. I would not even, I think that the narrative has been that the black church has been the center of black social life, but that's only because we've manufactured the rhetoric to be as such. There's many places that have always been the center of black life, such as the Blues Club.
Yeah,
blues music never got that kind of attention compared to the spirituals and the gospels, because as I argue in religion and hip hop, there's always been a Christian theological hegemony and a titillation with the black church, that which I call black church in the kind of spirit of market maintenance, invoking Marx there, if you will.
Well, what's funny about this point is that post 1950s, black folks didn't even buy or patronize blues at all, because we've always created music in a very practical and pragmatic sense. So literally, once we get to the real, powerful movement of the civil rights movement, we toss blues over our left shoulder and pick up R&B and keep moving, right? And so the fact is, and you can look at many blues artists, their names are Reverend Gary Davis, Reverend this, Reverend that. So you do have that, Christianization piece within there. But the point that I want to make is that there are more theologically sound rappers than there are theologically sound pastors and preachers, and I'm gonna leave it there as one.
And you raised an interesting point, and Ebony, I'm gonna ask you to kind of jump in here because, when you first came on the show a few years ago, Ebony, we talked about what was this controversy about Jay-Z's music and Satan worship, right? And for many folks, hip hop is the face of evil, right, in terms of its civic face. But at the same time, hip hop, particularly in comparison to contemporary gospel music, if there is a musical expression or even creative expression in the Black community that continuously names evil in the world, if you will, we find that coming from hip hop, not from BB and CC Winans, right? Not from Fred Hammond, right? Not from all these other, right? It's coming from hip hop, in which the folks, whether we're talking about conscious rappers like a Jasiri X, or even moments when very popular rappers take a moment to kind of name evil in the world, we see that more the case in terms of hip hop than we see in other kinds of forms. I mean, how do you respond, Professor Utley, to folks who will say, well, hip hop, it's backward in terms of looking at a progressive political vision at this point in time?
I mean, as a critic, it's my responsibility to give people possibilities for interpretation. So here's a text that you're familiar with. What if we look at it this way? And what if we turn it around and flip it upside down and look at it at another way? Okay, so that raises a whole new set of questions. So let's talk about context. And that's what I love so much about hip hop, and that's why I will always ride for rap music, is because it initiates conversations that are so difficult to have in other ways. We can talk about race, we can talk about deindustrialization, we can talk about sexual orientation, we can talk about gender politics. I mean, Kanye's Twitter conversation about Fitch over the weekend, I thought was wildly insightful. Right. And people were calling it a Twitter rant. I'm like, but this is what hip hop gives us. It gives us these important conversations that we'd be afraid to have or too uncomfortable to have in any other way. So I'm always proud of hip hop for calling evil on the carpet. And sometimes when it's not explicit, it's my job to say to people, but hey, what if we look at it this way?
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Ebony Utley, Professor Monica Miller, and Professor Emmett Price. We had a little mini summit on hip hop and religion. Before I let each of you go, what's up for you next? What's your next project, Professor Price?
I'm working on a follow-up to this book, based on the excitement generated around this book. I want to go from hip-hop culture a little broader to Black popular culture and look at the presentation and the representation of the Black church within TV, within movies, within athletics, within, the broad realm of Black popular culture, media, and looking at how, for some people, the Black church is presented, not only nationally but internationally. But then look at also how the Black church is represented. So I got to look at 2008 and the Obama controversy with Jeremiah Wright and how that captivated, the country and the world about this Black church, named Trinity United Church, up in Chicago, and how that set the perspective of what the Black church does, who it is, and what they're about. So that's where I'm going.
Professor Utley?
So rap and religion is essentially about how rappers align themselves with God as a form of power. So I'm really interested in power. And my next project is going to be about infidelity and sex and their relationship to power.
Professor Miller.
So I'm actually wrapping up a book right now called Blacklandia, which is a spinoff of Portlandia, The Subtleties of Race in Portland. And it's really all about how our kind of postmodern theoretical imagination around this category that we call race sort of collides with our own experiences with paranoia and anxiety and how other people see us. And it's about these kinds of collision experiences that I have here in Portland, Oregon. And I also have a large-scale survey project looking at it's called Remaking Religion, and looking at young people in religion in Portland, Oregon, a place where, we suggest in the literature that young people are highly de-churched and not religious, but highly spiritual.
Emmett Price, Associate Professor of Music and African American Studies at Northeastern University, the editor of the new book, The Black Church and Hip Hop Culture Toward Bridging the Generational Divide. Ebony Utley, who's Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at California State Long Beach, the author of the new book, Rap and Religion, Understanding the Gangster's God, and Monica R. Miller, Visiting Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Lewis and Clark College, and author of the new book, Religion and Hip Hop. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
It's been a privilege. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything. All black, you know. All black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, you know, say. All black everything. All black, you know. All black in the name of all my black heroes. All